There is the term, perhaps it's related especially to psychiatry and psychology, of paranoia. What do we mean then if we say somebody is paranoid? Perhaps part of the problem is that there are so many terms sometimes for a certain core concept that we can't make sense of what the core issue is. For instance, in U.S. psychiatry, there's the term paranoid, there's the term paranoid personality disorder, and then there's perhaps the more palatable term hypervigilant, often as applied to those who suffered a traumatic incident, whether on a battlefield or in childhood or marriage, or as per being financially poor or an immigrant, or even female often, or as per body type, if short or tall, or unsymmetrical in appearance. And then there's this term, you're being oversensitive, or you're just imagining it. So then, where do we decide what criteria is there for who is, quote, hypervigilant, who is oversensitive? You might say, who is trigger happy versus who is not? What is this term, thus, paranoia? Where does this come from? And why did Otto Kernberg, a psychoanalyst, I'm not sure if still alive in New York City, but a man originally from Europe and then having lived in Chile, country of Chile, and then America, once having said that Americans, in his view, were the most paranoid people he's ever met. If not on the entire planet, perhaps you might say, in some circles. Where does the term paranoia come from? What's being alluded to, and why so many terms to discuss the same core concept in my mind, which I'll elucidate right here? Well, first, I'd say it's rather subjective. Who is saying this term upon someone else, you're paranoid or not? Are they a very aggressive person saying that the person who feels very fearful is paranoid? Or are the people on the short end of the stick in that department simply concerned, shall we say, and labeling it violence, strong violence? Are they being oversensitive then? Whose yardstick are we using? Even the term crime or violent crime. Some consider violent crime a very fearful thing. Others say just roll with the punches, or maybe it's even good to experience a violent crime. You may never know what silver lining it could have for you later in life. You may never know if it pushed you out of your comfort zone and made you question things. Just like a physician of mine, so to speak, integrative medicine practitioner, says that many of his patients, he being a top cancer specialist in the country, have a wake-up call and are so grateful to have cancer. It's the first time in their life they ever questioned anything and got challenged. So who's to say then whether even crime, violent crime, is something we ought to be overly frightened of or concerned of, or whether it could be a silver lining, a blessing? How do you interpret all that? Thus, what is paranoia? And what is being even, shall we say, trigger happy about something we are supposedly very terrified of? Well, this is somewhat more illuminated, I think, by a little 7-minute video on YouTube by Dr. Aaron Beck, B-E-C-K-A-A-R-O-N. He had a lot to do with the starting of cognitive behavioral therapy. And while I would debate all the merits of it or not, seems to me he had a great point when he talked of how, in this video, in his opinion, almost all psychiatric problems, as he called them, have to do with a core concept of catastrophizing. Note, he did not use the word paranoia, but catastrophizing. And in my mind, that being the core issue then. So, for instance, there's someone I know who buckles their 2 small dogs in the back seat of their car every time they go somewhere with the dogs, lest there be an accident and the dogs suffer injury. Now, I heard lately a show somewhere where this in fact happened to a driver. Their dogs had been cast about in the passenger cabin of the car during a sudden stop or whatever. You might argue, well, maybe what we're talking about by paranoia or catastrophizing is simply an overestimation of the dangers involved of it happening. You took a wrong risk assessment as per either the probability of it happening or the possible danger. But then that begs the question of being what some call obsessive-compulsive, in the sense of worrying about every little detail, and if it falls short, the phrase everything going to HELL in a handbasket, i.e. catastrophizing something falling apart, whether you call it loss of control. Now, it used to be that large segments of humanity were concerned with punishment after death in flames. Call it torture forever, if you will. That fading somewhat in view, I think, in modern times as a viewpoint. But at any rate, that was considered, I say, the archetype of catastrophizing for who would want to feel torture, so to speak, forever and ever. But it seems to me that on a more subtle level, many today have the same viewpoint, only in areas other than, shall we say, flames after death. We catastrophize somehow that pain would be of an intolerable nature before death, not just the notion after death or viewpoint after death. Now, I'm not going to go into the details, but strikes me just off the top of my head, which is not so off the top of my head, really. I've thought about it for some years, is what about issues like chronic illness, chronic pain, loss of reputation, loss of predictability in life, loss of freedom as we call it, where you can live and what you can bring to where you live, say in old age. What about loss of possessions? What about loss of a spouse or loved one in general, or child? If we term that these are unbearable, the experiences of such, then maybe we're going to be talking about a catastrophe in our mind that we once were most focused on as per flames, burning in flames after death. But now we seem to have sometimes the same viewpoint of things happening before death on the same par. We might even catastrophize ending up on our deathbed feeling regrets that we can't handle the pain thereof, or feeling possible shame, guilt. Some of these, even loss of self-esteem. Some of these in our head as to how you interpret things, and others based on pain physically. Yet there are those who say even physical pain is in part how we interpret it, and that how we interpret it in turn plays into endorphins there or not called upon by the body. Or even as Norman Cousins was talking about, laughter is the best medicine against certain forms of pain maybe, or degenerative processes, or both. Finally, it strikes me that it can be catastrophized, the loss of the hope of leaving a good legacy, although that is a very questionable term to me as to the totality of the image you're going to leave, because what person has ever died and left a solid legacy in the eyes of all people as opposed to only some people? Depends upon the eye of the beholder. I'll close with this one example that comes to mind. There is a Dr. Beck, not the Aaron Beck. This is a female PhD holding sociologist, 3 degrees from Harvard. I'll just mention that for what it is. And she has many interesting ideas, some put in book form, others on YouTube shows. She has a book on integrity, amongst others. And when she was in graduate school at Harvard, she became pregnant, and she was told upon a medical test being done that she was going to bear a child that would have Down syndrome. And 5 physicians urged her to abort the pregnancy. She decided not to, adamantly, had the child, and said that was the most important decision perhaps in her life, and she is so happy that she stuck to her guns and did this. You might call it, in a sense, the silver lining effect, in my mind, of the benefits versus the downsides of what she experienced then by having the child. I like to think that, in a sense, the silver lining in so many ways for so-called adversities we tend to want to shun and plan against, and even catastrophize if we think would happen, is the silver lining effect of pushing us out of our comfort zone that otherwise we would stay in, often to our deathbed, if we have a deathbed, instead, say, of a big widowmaker heart attack, or getting dying suddenly in a vehicle accident, or massive stroke. What better way to experience even what psychologists would say flooding, as per desensitization by flooding, rather than slow, gradual, systematic desensitization? You might call it baby steps. What better way to experience rapid change you would never choose on your own than by this so-called thing happening that we would often consider a catastrophe, if not forced upon us. Hence why my physician, shall we say saying on TV that for many, his patients having come down with cancer was the best thing that ever happened to them, whereas they would have regarded it earlier as a catastrophe. Hence, why catastrophize anything if it could have a profound silver lining in terms of pushing us out of our comfort zone to become philosophers of a sort, to question, to become more skeptical, to delve into things that otherwise we tended to push into the background, often by some escape mechanism of choice. Choice not a factor, really, though. So that's what I'm talking about in my mind, then. If we're going to talk the term paranoia, hypervigilance, worry, excessive fears, terror feelings about something happening or other, maybe it's all part of the fear of something being on the order of burning in flames forever, when in fact many a pain we fear as a catastrophe supposedly could be a profound learning experience we think we wouldn't be benefiting by, especially if we think we know it all already. And maybe Maybe we need a wake-up call. Maybe we need the training imposed upon us by things we would consider a catastrophe that have the strong silver lining effect of pushing us out of a comfort zone to growth, and that being experiences, insights, heightened levels of compassion, understanding that we never knew we could experience. All from the so-called catastrophe we tried to prevent, which was not burning in flames at the same temperature forever and ever, without respite, and with little chance of learning anything of value and applying it, by the way.